All right, so thank you everyone for coming, and now I'll hand it over to Elizabeth.
Hello, everybody. Happy snowy Wednesday. Hopefully, everybody's able to get out of their driveways. I haven't tried yet, so luckily, this is all via Zoom. Um, the PowerPoint for today is kind of large. I don't anticipate that we have to get through all of it. At the end, I'll go over or attempt to go over a couple of kinds of scenarios that may come up in your client sessions. My cat may also try to interject here. Come on. Um, if we're running low on time, I can go over what some of those options are and have folks kind of pick what they do want to go over while I'm here to talk about it. There's also going to be an information doc included in the documents that you get. So that will have a big glossary. It will also have all of those scenarios spelled out and how to approach different clients coming in with different kinds of issues around polyamory or ethical non-monogamy. Like Megan said, we'll hold off on questions until the end. I will get off on a million different kinds of tangents and completely lose my place. So that's just really kind of just to help keep me organized. All right, well, let's start. So, introduction to polyamory and ethical non-monogamy for mental health clinicians. First, kind of like what makes me um, appropriate to give this talk. So, I am a clinical therapist. I have LGSW, went through our wonderful program here at WVU. I graduated in 2020. I work at Unbound Counseling here in Morgantown. I primarily work with clients with kind of the umbrella term of neurodiversity, right? And within that, what I'm really talking about is neurodevelopmental disorders. So, autism, ADHD, Tourette's. I work with a lot of folks with learning disorders. OCD is often a common comorbidity there. Generalized anxiety and depression are often common comorbidities there. And I found within working with this community, really need to be well versed also in LGBTQ plus issues, in non-traditional relationship styles, including polyamory, including this umbrella term of ethical non-monogamy, kink, really need to be versed in. And that's just from working with this population alone. So when I started working as a clinical therapist, I had people coming into me who were looking for somebody who understood autism or understood ADHD, and they're also like, "Hey, I'm poly. Is that anything that you know about?" And I didn't at first, and I quickly learned. Full disclosure, I am not poly. I'm not in an ethical non-monogamy relationship style. I am monogamous. Again, why does that make me appropriate to be giving this talk? Well, because I can. It is still a situation, a relationship style in which there is a lot of inherent bias in our community. I think that's probably getting better, but and not necessarily because people demonize it, just because they don't know anything about it, right? And oftentimes we kind of tend to other or demonize or see wrong things and things that we just don't know anything about. And I say that both as the full disclosure and as a part of my learning opportunity here, because if there's anybody in the audience, and statistically speaking, the chances are good that there are folks in the audience who are poly or who do identify as being in an ethical non-monogamy relationship style or a consensual non-monogamy relationship style. If I say something that's off or wrong or offensive, please tell me. I want to know. I want to learn better. That's going to be an ongoing theme through this because to be um, good clinicians to our clients with these kinds of relationship styles, we have to do a lot of homework. Non monogamy in itself involves a whole lot of homework. Okay, I think that's enough of me going on about me. So what are we going to be looking at? A couple of visuals. What are ethical non-monogamy and polyamory? We're going to talk about some relationship styles, types of ethical non-monogamy. I'm just going to say E and M. That's just going to drive me up the wall. So poly partners, other important terms, attachment. So those of us working in trauma, we know it's really, really important to take in consideration some of the attachment styles that our clients are working with. So there's some research out there, which I've included in this presentation about attachment and polyamory. Approaching different kinds of clients and being better for our clients. Also included some tips for specific scenarios. But even if we don't get to that today, that's included in the supplemental information that you'll get. Um, I'm really bad with talking too fast. So if that happens, I'll try to pay attention to the chat and just let me know if I'm going way too fast. Okay. Hi to the people who know me and are saying hello. I appreciate that. What is it we're talking about when we talk about poly and ethical non-monogamy? So this umbrella term, right? That is the ethical non-monogamy, or again, also sometimes referred to as consensual non-monogamy, so CNM. That can include things like stranger sex, random hookups, swinging, a term that some of you may be familiar with already, friends with benefits, a term lots of people are familiar with, relationship anarchy, a term that a lot of people may not be familiar with, and then polyamory itself. And this umbrella is this illustration is not exhaustive. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that can come along. And that can cook a little bit like this. Now, this is the scary E&M chart. I'm not going to start talking about this going into this. This is just like to illustrate how complicated these relationship styles and communication within them can be. Okay, and how much um, uh, goes into identity formation and learning. So this is a little bit more palatable. Okay, some types of ethical non-monogamy in this illustration. Again, we have that E and M kind of big circle, and within that we have things like open relationships, swinging, polyamory, and off to the side, kind of connected but not really connected, we have relationship anarchy. Get a copy of which chart? The big one? Yeah, I think Megan took care of that. And in the presentation down in the notes, I do have citations of where I pulled this information too, so that is available. So what are ethical non-monogamy and polyamory with some relationship styles? So defining terms, ethical non-monogamy or ENM, sometimes referred to as consensual non-monogamy or CNM, is the practice of being romantically involved with multiple people who are all aware of and agree to a particular relationship structure. That's really important here, that everybody is aware and that everybody consents. Okay. Polyamory is the practice of having multiple intimate relationships, whether sexual or just romantic, with the full knowledge and consent of all parties involved. Polyamory is generally not gender specific, and anyone can have multiple partners of any gender. So, Elizabeth, those things sound exactly like. And the answer to that is yes, but no. Polyamory is one type of relationship style that falls under the umbrella of ethical non-monogamy. So all polyamory is ideally ethical non-monogamy, but not all ethical non-monogamy is polyamory. Polyamory specifically refers to multiple loving relationships, whereas ethical non-monogamy is any arrangement where people have multiple consensual romantic, sexual, and or intimate connections. So relationship styles, and this list is not exhaustive. It's fluid. All of this is, you kind of have to think of it as like a living being itself. It is fluid. It is constantly changing and evolving. It is a community. For some folks, it is akin to an identity. So it is something that we can kind of have to chase it around all the time to be able to define it. Terms are always changing, understanding is always changing. So open relationship. Open relationships are a form of non-monogamy, while by definition, polyamory centers love. Open relationships typically center more on physical and or sexual connections. No doubt, some people in open relationship also name and acknowledge crushes on others, and members may be in love with additional people. However, typically people in open relationships prioritize the emotional stability, soundness, and security of just one partner while still allowing for extra relationship physical connections. Oftentimes, you'll see people in swinging communities identify as being in an open relationship. A lot of the language around, especially in the beginning of an already established relationship, um, evolving into or an attempt to evolve into something that has multiple partners may is called opening up. So swingers, sometimes known as people in the lifestyle, are non-monogamous folks who prioritize sexual relationships with people outside their usually two-person relationship rather than emotional entanglements. The terms I'm sharing with everybody today, again, this is not an exhaustive glossary. A longer one is included in the documentation that's being sent out, but part of it is like we have to go through all of the definitions of all of these words and then reread it because some of the definitions you have to know are already in the other definitions. I don't know if that made sense, but it takes a couple of read throughs through here to really understand all of the terms that you're reading. So thruple, the word thruple is a combo of words couple and three. The term refers to a balanced, intentional, and committed relationship between three people. Typically, the relationship between the three people is romantic, loving, and loving. When three people have a purely sexual relationship, the term threesome or three-way is usually used instead. The term thruple may be common in the media, but most non-monogamous folks use the word triad to describe their three-person relationship. Um, so triad. Most commonly, people use the term triad when all three people are romantically and or sexually involved with each other. However, sometimes people use the word triad for different relationship shapes too. So, for instance, people in a V relationship where one person is sexually and or romantically involved with two people, but neither of those other two people are sexually or romantically involved. Quad. Simply put, a quad is a four-person relationship. Specifically, it's a four-person relationship that is romantic and or sexual. It may be closed to the four people within the dynamic, or it may have space for other romantic and sexual partners. Don't ask, don't tell, or DADT, is an open relationship agreement where one or both partners are free to engage with sex with other people, so long as they don't tell their primary partner or give very few and already agreed to details. Hierarchical polyamory. So, hierarchical polyamory is a polyamorous relationship wherein there is a ranking system amongst an individual's romantic and or sexual partnerships. Typically, these partners are denoted as primary, seconds, triary, and so on. For some in the ethical non-monogamy community, hierarchical polyamory is not considered to be ethical. Okay? Usually, the primary partners in hierarchical relationships get priority over the person's time, resources, and emotional capacity. Sometimes the primary partner is allowed to set boundaries around what kind of sex their partners have with their other partners, as well as what kinds of activities they can do together and how deep emotions can get. And we can already kind of guess that hierarchical polyamory, when we get into being able to have veto power over what two other people do in a relationship and the kinds of emotions that they're allowed to have, can get pretty sticky and or not ethical. So non-hierarchical polyamory. No partner is given preference over the others. May spend equal amounts of time together or participate equally in making major decisions, such as having children or buying a house. This situation is also sometimes called egalitarian polyamory. And remember too, when we're dealing with definitions of things, we're very much in the realm of ideals, not necessarily what plays out in real life. So relationship anarchy. It's a kind of a buzzword right now. If you go into reading anything or listening to anything about poly or ethical non-monogamy, you're going to run into the term relationship anarchy. Okay. As the term anarchy suggests, relationship anarchy is a relationship model that rejects traditional relationship norms. Relationship anarchy is a style where there are no rules, expectations, or limitations beyond what the people in the relationship explicitly decide. Uh, Relationship anarchy is a relationship style that is not specific to sexual or romantic relationships, but it may include them. Okay. So, relationship anarchy and polyamory do kind of have this like loose affiliation with each other, but aren't the same thing. You can have somebody who identifies as a relationship anarchist, but is not polyamorous or is not non-monogamous. So, garden party polyamory, GPP, is a type of relationship that an individual's other partners or their metamors have. It's essentially a softened version of kitchen table polyamory. And here we're getting into that, like, in order to know what I'm saying here, you would have already needed to read through all of the terms, but we'll just keep going. Though neither option is universally better and more evolved than the other. Here, the non-romantic partners in a polycule or a network of interconnected group of people who are involved in polyamorous relationships with one another aren't very close. You still like and respect one another, but aren't necessarily friends. So we kind of envision it as it suggests that you and your partner can host a party where you'd or go to a party where you'd feel comfortable going and interacting with your partners and vice versa. You know, everybody's cool with each other, but you aren't necessarily deeply involved in their partners' lives. Kitchen table polyamory, again, another buzzy word right now, is the kind of polyamory most commonly represented in the media and on TV shows. It names a configuration wherein all or any combination of the partners and the metamors feel comfortable enough to hang out around the kitchen table, sharing a meal or coffee. That doesn't mean that they all live together, but there is some level of familiarity where everyone is comfortable hanging out with their partners as well as the other people their partner is dating. So the way that I kind of envision it is that everybody, like, maybe you had a rated G or PG sleepover the night before with your partner and all the metamors, and the next morning everybody's making breakfast for each other and hanging out in the kitchen and having a good time and sharing a laugh, and you know that's kind of what I envision there. Parallel polyamory is the idea that a person may have multiple relationships and that those people know about the other's existence, but they don't ever spend any time together or interact. Though this is rarely a hard and fast rule, but rather just a preference for how much a metamor's lives intersect. For example, it is not uncommon in parallel polyamory for the metamors to have met, to be connected on social media, and or to have each other's phone numbers in case of an emergency. To be clear, parallel polyamory is a valid preference and structure. Sometimes people judge parallel polyamory, assuming that it's less evolved than kitchen table polyamory. And this is one of the things that you can get more into when talking with clients who are interested in polyamory, or who already may be at various levels within the community, right? There can be at any given time um, ideas about what the right way of doing things are. And as with anything, the old way of doing something is the wrong way, and the new way of doing something is the right way. So there can be a lot of pressure on folks, especially new to polyamory, to pick up kitchen table polyamory and to have that as the ideal relationship structure. Solo polyamory. Solo polyamory means that someone has multiple intimate relationships with people, but has an independent or single lifestyle. They may not live with partners, share finances, or have a desire to reach traditional relationship milestones in which partners' lives become more intertwined. Okay. So types of poly partners. Again, not exhaustive. An anchor partner. And that is exactly what it sounds like. So an anchor partner is a partner who you plan to have in your life for a long time. Anchor partners consider one another when making major life decisions. The connection between them is stable, and both or all feel secure that the relationship isn't going anywhere. An anchor may or may not be a nesting partner. A comet. A comet refers to a romantic and or sexual partner who you only see in person every so often. There are a wide variety of reasons you may not see this person regularly, such as a relationship saturation, scheduling, or the relationship being long distance. Common relationships don't denote a lack of seriousness. Hinge. A hinge partner is the partner between two or more people who are not in a relationship with each other. So think door hinge, right? You have the door hinge that connects the wall, one partner, to the door, the other partner. Metamor, also known as someone's meta. Your metamor is your partner's partner or their partners, uh, who you are not also dating. If you are also dating your partner's partner, meaning you are both dating the same person, you would not be metamors. You would just be partners. Nesting partner. A nesting partner, simply put, is a person you share a home with. If you do not live with a partner, you are not a nesting partner. While nesting partners are more than roommates, they are not necessarily romantic or sexual. It is possible for nesting partners to be platonic. Primary and secondary partners. So the prioritized relationship partner, whereas the secondary relationship or the part or partner are often getting often given less priority and power in poly relationship structures. Primary is typically seen as it could be the nesting partner. It could be if a more traditional monogamous relationship or marriage has now opened up to polyamory. It may be that the first relationship is considered the primary relationship. There can be a lot of different ways that that occurs. Unicorn, an individual who prefers to have relationships with both partners of a primary couple in an established relationship. These relationships often have disproportionate power dynamics, and the unicorn is expected to follow the rules of the primary partnership. So, um, what about this kind of style is similar to unicorns? I'm not going to take answers, but it's because like it doesn't really actually exist in real life. Now, that's not to say that it never happens, right? This is because it is absolutely a possibility. It's a thing that does happen. It's the thing that will always happen. In the community itself, it is considered not ethical. It's usually occurring with folks who are just coming into ethical non-monogamy or polyamory or the swinging community for the first time. It's often young folks that this kind of thing happens to. It is generally frowned upon. So other important terms, compersion is the experience of feeling joy in response to someone we care about feeling joy. While compersion is a goal for many people in ethical non-monogamous relationships, it is not necessary or compulsory. It is also something that occurs outside of polyamory or relationships, sexual or romantic relationships at all. Compersion, we can have compersion for anybody that we care about. New relationship energy, or NRE, is the excitement that comes with new relationships in its early stages. It can be extremely positive, but for some people it may be challenging and or unpleasant. NRE can cause problems in already established relationships. And then the polycule is a network of interconnected relationships. Polycules may be open or they may be closed. Open just means that there is some version of allowing other partnerships into the polycule, and closed means that no, everybody within the polycule doesn't have any other kind of relationship, at least sexual or intimate or romantic, with anybody else. Doesn't count platonic. So, take a break here. See if there's any questions in the chat.
I have a question. Excuse me.
Sure.
I've been hearing the term lavender relationship. I think that's the term
Hmm.
people use more recently. What does that refer to?
So that's kind of an old terminology in more the LGBTQ plus sphere of things, but it could be a part of the polyamory community or the ethical non-monogamy community. Lavender relationship historically is defined as one or more, we're assuming a couple, one or more of the couple is LGBTQ plus, and that they're forming a relationship to take advantage of policies or benefits that
Mm.
are more likely to be given to people in monogamous straight relationships. Oftentimes, you would see lavender marriages before we changed marriage laws in the country, before gay marriage was legal across the country at the federal level. I think one of the reasons we're talking about that more often now is because of all of the potential cuts or threats to gay marriage, marriage equality in the country right now, both real and perceived. So, yeah, I hope that
Okay.
answers your question.
Yep.
Somebody raised their hand. Was that you?
Yeah, I had I have a question, or consideration. I guess I worked in the field here in West Virginia for a long time and mostly with older adults. I did have some women that I worked with that were, and so I don't know if you can speak to this. They were sisters, but they were in a relationship with the same man most of their life. Like one sister had the child, but they lived together basically as a throuple, so that maybe not the most healthy relationship, but in a small kind of community, a remote community and so forth, these different kind of relationships form. I mean, like these kind of relationships aren't new, but so I don't know if you can speak to that at all. That I don't even know if that would be considered incest. It's a definitely um it was interesting.
Uh, it is, yeah, it is definitely interesting. And the fact that, that was formed in a small community, probably independent from any other information that really exists out there about polyamory. And one of the reasons why things like ethical non-monogamy and polyamory are becoming more popular is because of the advent of the information revolution, right? We all have access to online, and we all have access to all of these new ideas about how we can form relationships and attachments. So, yeah, what was going on there was what you termed it first was a throuple, probably something like that. I can't speak to whether or not it would be incest. That would really only be relevant if the sisters were having like romantic or sexual relationships with each other. And just with the information that you've given, we can't know that. But we can know that there was a throuple relationship there. And like you said, it could be a lot of reasons why that happened. Maybe within the community was so small and the eligibility of other people to marry or have fulfilling relationships with was really small. Maybe it started with one singular relationship and something happened in the wider family system. Do we use the term incest here, or is there another term? Really, I'm not sure if in this, based on what we know about this situation, I don't think incest is an appropriate term. And it's not an effort to be PC. I just don't know that it's true that the sisters did have a romantic or sexual relationship with each other. It may have been that that only occurred with the husband figure in the relationship, but I don't know.
Yeah, we didn't know that, but I will just kind of just thinking about working with people in the community. There was also a perception of that because most people are not as informed
Yeah,
about, right? Like there's a perception of that.
right,
So when you're working with folks, it's just something to
right.
consider, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And part of that goes back to like small town drama and small town like talking about people and things like that. That's not surprising at all. I hope I answered your question.
No, yeah, that's good.
See what time is it? We'll get to the attachment. So, an ethical non is ethical non-monogamy associated with insecure attachment? So, perhaps surprising research suggests that those participating in ethical non-monogamy relationship styles are no more likely than their monogamous counterparts to have insecure attachment styles. I, as a therapist and as a lecturer probably say at least once a week, there are more differences within a group than there are between groups. And that's no different here for polyamory or ethical non-monogamy. So research also suggests that some forms of ethical non-monogamy relationship styles may be beneficial for those with insecure attachment styles, utilizing the heavily prescribed communication and communication expectations and tools. Again, that's the homework that I talked about a little bit earlier, utilized within the non-monogamy communities can assist in decreasing issues related to insecure attachment styles. Anxious attachment. So there is conflicting research on if those with anxious attachment would prefer ethical non-monogamy relationship styles. Those with anxious attachment are less likely than those with secure and avoidant attachment styles to find satisfaction in ethical non-monogamy. Anxious attachers may agree to ethical non-monogamy because they want to please their partner. They may constantly seek their approval and affection, and possibly because they might want more attention from having multiple partners. Okay. Anxious attachers are hyper aware of their feelings and of their partners, meaning they are more likely to want to communicate about difficult emotions. And ethical non-monogamy communication is essential. So with their work on attachment triggers, anxious attachers could do well in non-monogamy relationships. It's possible. So avoidant attachment. There is no consistent evidence that avoidant attachment style is more common compared to any other attachment styles in people in ethical non-monogamy relationships. That's kind of one of the accusations that's hurled at people in ethical non-monogamy, particularly for people who practice that solo version of non-monogamy. Research suggests that avoidant attachers have more positive opinion of ethical non-monogamy. Again, this is most likely because avoidant attachers prefer to keep their emotions private and may prefer to invest less in an emotional or single relationship. However, not all ethical non-monogamous relationships involve less commitment. Some do involve multiple serious commitments, as is in the case with polyamory. Polyamory in particular can be difficult for avoidant attachers because these relationships require a high degree of emotional intimacy and vulnerability. So disorganized attachment. There is little research on disorganized attachment and ethical non-monogamy. Some research shows that anxious attachers experience less distress in relationships with a primary partner as opposed to a secondary partner. This suggests that if one with disorganized attachment does want to experiment with ethical non-monogamy, doing it with a primary partner may be the most accessible style. So secure attachment, of all the studies that exist, or at least the ones that I found, right? One of the main findings is that people in ethical non-monogamy relationships reap similar benefits to secure attachers in secure relationships. A greater percentage of polyamorous people are secure than those in monogamous relationships. Since secure attachers deal with their vulnerability more easily than insecure attachers, they experience a greater ease of comfort with intimacy with others. Research shows that people in ethical non-monogamous relationships experience greater trust, intimacy, friendship, and honesty, as well as fewer issues with jealousy with their partners than those in monogamous relationships. Caveat, those who have done the homework, those who have done the work, those who have gone through the process of unlearning traditional relationship styles. Point A to point B here is fairly large gap. Studies show engaging and building upon multiple romantic relationships can help decrease feelings of anxiety and insecurity. This is because of the higher frequency with which partners having these intense emotions. In turn, this open communication is a step closer to developing secure attachment. So approaching ethical non-monogamy and polyamory in clients. I want to leave time for questions. Let's see how fast. A lot of this is kind of a repeat. Let's see. Oh no, that's a different part of the, sorry, my bad. So I'm going to get up on a little bit of a soapbox here. And one of the reasons I was telling Megan before we opened up the session here that one of the reasons I wanted to present this material is because there are a lot of folks out there who do have non-monogamous relationship styles or are interested in non-monogamous relationship styles, or it's something that their partner heard about and now wants to start doing and they are freaked out about it, right? So as psychotherapists, we really do need to be aware of these relationship styles, what they look like when they're good and healthy, and what they look like when they're not good and when they're not healthy, so that we can help our clients navigate through all of the kinds of issues that come up with thinking about and or starting this journey, right? Or even people that have been in polyamorous relationships for a long time be like, okay, cool, it sounds like you're doing this in a really healthy way, or hey, it sounds like this may be not the most healthy way for you to be doing this. How does that line up with other issues that are going on for you? So approaching these clients, the psychotherapist needs to have had enough self-development to respect and honor the client's polyamory. We have to do homework too. We have to be well versed in the vocabulary of ethical non-monogamy and common problems, the solutions, and the benefits. The psychotherapist needs to not frame polyamory as a problem or as a distortion or a deviation from what should be the norm, which is monogamy. This is a common complaint and fear of individuals entering into new therapeutic relationships. I get people quite often who, after telling me all the other stuff that they want to be able to talk about in therapy, they'll mention polyamory and act a little bit squirrely about it. Like they have all of a sudden and like started talking about something that is bad because they don't know how I'm going to react, even though on my Psychology Today it says that I'm allied. And I have to be like, hey, yeah, I know about the community. I'm not personally in the community, but um, you don't have to be my teacher. I am my own teacher here. So psychotherapist needs to be familiar with the current consensus of what is considered ethical and what is not considered ethical in non-monogamy communities. Again, that is fluid. The psychotherapist needs access to familiarity with various resources, including reading, listening, watching materials, worksheets, and communication techniques widely utilized within the community. The psychotherapist needs to communicate to their client that they are active in their own learning about ethical non-monogamy. They are allied and they are not the expert in the room about the client's experiences. Ways that we can be better clinicians for our ethical non-monogamy clients. Again, educate ourselves on a continuous basis and address internal biases. We can provide the same level of care and respect to ethical non-monogamy communities and the individuals within as we do for other marginalized groups. Promote what we are educated about and allied with the community on our promotional and practice websites. Provide options for ethical non-monogamy on demographic forums, and better understand barriers to care in our respective fields across healthcare and in community services for non-monogamy clients. So tips for specific scenarios. And this was kind of what I got into talking about. Um, I'll go through and show you what I have here. Again, all of this is included on the extra info doc that Megan put in the chat. But if there is anything that anybody really wants to go over while we're talking about it right now. So my established client brings up an interest in exploring ethical non-monogamy or polyamory. And I'll just go ahead and talk about this one. And again, like this isn't a rule. This is based on my experience in working with poly clients, a way of approaching talking to them about it that is systematic, and you can kind of check off the box until you learn more about what your style is going to be. So this is not exhaustive. This is something for you to take and use and add to. Validate ethical non-monogamy and policy as a real and potentially rewarding relationship style. Assess how long they've considered embarking into ethical non-monogamy or polyamory, and what is the context of their current interest. Assess what sources they are learning about poly from, and what aspects they are interested in learning about in the immediate future. Okay, and then suggest resources. Assess what kind of ethical non-monogamy they are interested in pursuing. This will give you more insight into what they already know about ethical non-monogamy. Assess how their partner, if they have one, currently communicate with each other about polyamory. Suggest resources. Access what the timeline for your client has for embarking in ethical non-monogamy. Discuss the importance of taking time to learn, communicate, establish boundaries with current partners before actively seeking new partnerships and relationships. Okay. There are differing opinions on how long this process should take. It is important to consider context and the health of your client's current relationship. Based on what I've learned, there is a consensus of at least 3 to 6 months of homework and strengthening communication prior to dating others. And depending on context, 12 months to 3 years in the case of a pregnancy or just having a newborn is also suggested in as like the learning, building communication time. Okay. So our options are, my client reported their partner recently communicated to them they want to try polyamory, and my client is unsure how they feel about it. My client reported their partner recently communicated to them they want to try poly, and my client is happy or cautiously optimistic. My client reported recently communicated they want to try poly, and my client is not happy or they are fearful. After some time discussing polyamory with my client, I believe they are in a poly under duress situation. Now, we haven't talked about that yet. I haven't touched base on what poly under duress is. So that is a situation in which a person's partner has essentially given them an ultimatum. Like either we go poly or or some version of non-monogamy, or the relationship is over. So in that kind of situation, you want to revisit the discussion about the importance of taking time to learn and communicate and establish boundaries with their current partner before actively seeking new relationships. Again, there are differing opinions. Assess the current agreements, boundaries, and expectations, communication processes they have with the partner and how they feel about those. And then there are a list of things that's really important to let the people who identify as mono know. Because oftentimes when people are starting this process or learning more information, there's a lot of like really feel good, polyamory is so great. You'll hear a lot of it's actually more enlightened than monogamy, which is not true. And it can kind of make the mono folks. Sorry, does somebody have something to say? Or should we slow down? I'll stop there and I'll open up for questions. How about that? Before I go off on a million tangents. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to vocally ask, or you can put the question into chat.
Megan had a question she put in the chat about how does
How
cheating
does
fit into
cheating?
the discussion.
Yeah. Uh, so again, cheating can be very loosely defined, and it's the kind of thing where you have to work with the clients to establish what their rules about around cheating is, like what their definition, what has been the definition in the relationship thus far. And then if that is going against what their partner has done or what they would like to do, if that goes against what their already established definition is. That doesn't mean that there isn't room to create new definitions, but that is something that has to be done with their partner on a consensual basis. Did that answer your question? I've seen a variety. Again, it's that there are more differences within a group than there are between groups. So with some of the clients that I work with, yeah, it's a real mess. It's a real mess most of the time. And that can be for varying reasons. It can be a mess because their communication is out of whack, because they don't share things with their partners, because their attachment style, because of a lot of other things going on for them personally, is interacting with and counteracting to polyamory. Like polyamory isn't necessarily not working because it's polyamory. It's not working because the individual in the polyamorous relationship isn't doing a great job with it. Can it be successful? Yes. Um, is it sometimes not successful? Yes. Do you work with parents or siblings to help them understand complex relationships? I haven't personally worked with parents or siblings for folks who identify as polyamorous or non-monogamy. It doesn't mean that I wouldn't be willing to, or if it just came up that one of my clients was mentioned, like, hey, my kid did this, then I would use that as a learning opportunity, psychoed, things like that. So are you speaking in terms of maybe within their relationship that they're in, things that are happening are non-ethical or harmful, and you want to be supportive without shame? So again, that goes back to revisiting, um, look, you need to be doing your homework. This is what is okay and is not okay in any kind of personal relationship, like consent. If your partner is acting outside of what you're consenting to, that is not okay in a relationship. I have said to people, hey, this is not a polyamorous scenario. Based on what you say your relationship rules have been, this is cheating. And you have to kind of have those conversations with folks, revisit important things for people who are monogamous to remember about themselves, that there's absolutely nothing wrong with monogamy. Again, I hear a lot, oh, polyamory or ethical non-monogamy is the enlightened way to be. And it's just not true. It's just not true. And we have to reiterate those kinds of things for our clients and kind of like push that strength onto them to be able to tell themselves that, And if need be, when the time comes, to be able to say that to other people. At the same time, um, we have to let our clients make mistakes. Like we can't save them from going into or remaining in a bad relationship just because we can see it. Like I just say to myself, oh, it's a canon event, right? I can give them all of the information. I can push them towards ideas. I can push them towards understanding that at the end of the day, I can't change how they're going to have the relationship. Sometimes the only way out is through.
I have a question. We have two
Sure.
minutes. In the beginning, you said you worked a lot with neurodivergent folks, and I was wondering if you
Mhm.
see a correlation between like neurodivergent folks and poly relationships.
I think some of the research, and I need to get back into the research, might be bearing some of that out. Some of the more recent research is bearing out that there is a connection with non-traditional gender presentations or non-traditional sexual identities within the neurodivergent. And we're talking about neurodevelopmental disorders and neurodivergency here. That there are correlations there, significant correlations there. Oftentimes with neurodivergent folks, you will see kind of like anecdotally connections with kink, and that's because within the kink community, like it is it is full of instructions. You go and you talk to people in specific ways and you get specific instructions about how you're supposed to behave, and you give people specific instructions about how you want them to behave, and it is very especially autism friendly. So yeah, there's a lot of people within the kink community that are neurodivergent. And
Interesting.
then offshoots of that, you will like it turns into a Venn diagram sort of a thing. So if somebody is in the kink community, they might have a toe or an entire leg in the poly community or the ethical non-monogamy community, or may have at one point.
Very interesting. Thanks.
Mm.
All right. Well, it is 1 o'clock. So we will need to wrap up, but I just want to say thank you again, Elizabeth. This was very informative and I learned a lot. So yeah, so thank you so much. And all the folks who are here, we will send the CEUs to you. You'll get the email from Michael Brown, probably later today or tomorrow. So look out for that. So thank you again, Elizabeth. I'll
Thank you. I had a good time.
Yeah, of course. I'll leave the Zoom open for a second in case anyone needs to ask any questions.
Sure.
All right. Okay. Well, all right. I'm going to close the Zoom now, but thank you, everyone. Okay. Bye.